China and Russia reaffirm their no-limits partnership. Looking to build a new multipolar world order, leaders Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin meet in Beijing. Building on already strong strategic and economic ties, could their alliance challenge Western dominance? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Putin's visit to China. Their relationship makes sense. Both Russia and China have found themselves at odds with Western power brokers, both in terms of trade and, of course, strategic interest. They haven't had the easiest history together, but times have changed. Both have formally declared their goals to ease global reliance on the U.S. dollar, and while Russia has faced off against the West over Ukraine, China is looking at arguably similar dynamics over Taiwan. So has a common enemy of sorts strengthened the Russia-China bond, and could that lead to the multipolar world order they desire? Here's a look now at Putin's visit to China.
A show of unity from China and Russia. In keeping with tradition, Vladimir Putin made China his first stop after his presidential inauguration last week. Not that he had many choices. With an international criminal court arrest warrant hanging over him, the number of countries he can visit is limited. The trip marks the 75th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two countries. Their ties have seen ups and downs over the years, but since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the two sides are closer than ever. And now they're looking to further deepen those ties.
Russia-China relations have developed dynamically and reached an unprecedented high level. They are built on a solid foundation of good neighborliness, equality, mutual respect, and support. This is the strategic course that meets the fundamental interests of the peoples of Russia and China.
The main area of cooperation between the two countries is economic. After Western sanctions were imposed due to the conflict in Ukraine, Moscow turned to the east. And so while Russia's trade with the US and the EU has significantly decreased, its business with India and China last year increased. But this year, due to Chinese banks fearing they may be subject to secondary sanctions, trade has fallen. The payment difficulty is thought to be one of the key topics discussed by the two leaders.
Both countries' strategic cooperation has only strengthened as we continue to push for cooperation in the sectors of trade, investment, energy, cultural and regional exchanges. We have made active contributions towards maintaining global stability and promoting democratic international relations.
Putin's visit came just days after Russian forces launched a new offensive in Ukraine's Kharkiv region. Xi Jinping said Russia and China have agreed on a political solution to end the war in Ukraine. But Washington is wary of this expanding partnership and warns Beijing against funding Moscow's war efforts.
We find it unacceptable that Chinese companies are helping Putin wage this war against Ukraine. We've been very clear about that. And if China purports to support peace in Europe, it cannot continue to fuel the biggest threat of the European security.
Yet, in a joint statement signed by the two leaders, Russia and China agreed to expand their cooperation in energy, chemical industry, manufacturing, and mining. Xi and Putin also criticized US military alliances in the Asia-Pacific region and raised concerns over its missiles around the world that they say threaten Russia and China.
Joining me now to discuss the China-Russia relationship and its global implications are from Moscow. Viktor Olevich, he is lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics, a Moscow-based think tank. From Beijing, Zhao Ying is a political analyst on China and also a host at CGTN Radio. And from New York, senior foreign policy writer at Newsweek magazine, Tom O'Connor. Thanks all so much for being with me. Zhao Ying, I'll start with you, and let's talk about what stood out at this summit, because there's been a lot of mention of the fact that, it's very difficult for President Putin to actually travel anywhere because of that ICC arrest warrant. But he goes to China, a global power. He receives the red carpet treatment, so to speak, and is also called a best friend of leader Xi Jinping. It really does lend legitimacy to a leader who has been shunned more or less completely by the West, does it not?
Well, I mean, this year marks the 75th anniversary of China-Russia, since China and Russia established their diplomatic ties. So, I mean, that is kind of a very important milestone for the diplomatic relations. So I believe that is the background of this kind of relationship. And when you talk about the legitimacy of this visit, I believe actually we cannot say this war in Russia can affect the normal, bilateral trade. Bilateral visit, or this kind of meeting between the two countries, because I mean, of course, China can talk to both China can talk to both Russia and Ukraine to push for peaceful settlement. And actually, as we can see during this meeting, this is also one of the topics of their discussions. And actually, if you look at their joint statement, they also mentioned the Ukraine crisis. So I believe this kind of meeting will also be helpful to push for a peaceful settlement of the Ukraine crisis. And also, I think China and Russia has made it very clear that their relationship is non-confrontational, is not targeting any third parties. And also, I think China, as a responsible developing country, it has been looking to multipolar, more equitable world order with more voices being heard from the developing countries. And I believe this is a goal that is being shared by Russia. So I think this is what China-Russia relationship is primarily based on.
Okay, let me ask Tom, what do the two actually need most from each other? Where do their bilateral ties actually benefit each other the most?
Yeah, well, we often hear the U.S.-China relationship described as the most consequential, most important bilateral relationship in the world today. And I would agree with that, but I would say that the China-Russia relationship has really emerged as one of the most consequential relationships as well in the 21st century, starting with the 2001 Friendship Treaty, the establishment of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, and the expansion of those two organizations, and then just the sheer amount of cooperation that these two countries are engaging in, which has only expanded, of course, in recent years. So, when we look at the contours of this relationship, we're looking at China seeing Russia as a primary energy supplier. And although, of course, the war in Ukraine has impacted some of Russia's military prowess and capabilities, Russia still is one of the world's leading military powers. And so China has a lot to benefit there when it comes to defense. And of course, Russia seeing China as a major economic power, partner, the most important partner now more than ever. And of course, just the various levels of engagement from defense and trade to also geopolitical issues. Ukraine was mentioned. They also discussed during this trip North Korea, the Middle East, various levels of relationship. And of course, what this really comes down to, perhaps most importantly, is how much of this relationship can be used to not only cooperate, but also coordinate on bigger strategic issues. And I speak specifically of the United States right now, because the U.S. is very much looking to put pressure and apply pressure on both sides. I'm hoping that this relationship doesn't further develop in the way that it has been.
Interesting. I mean, and Tom, you've also talked about how they're looking at developing the relationship in a sense, not just bilaterally. They want others to see them as, I think you've termed it a bedrock of stability that other countries should want to ally themselves with. Do you think this meeting brought them any closer to that, kind of purporting this larger global image that they're even a safer, better, more prosperous bet than Western alliances would be?
Well, certainly seeing President Xi and Putin together, shaking hands, the red carpet treatment, as you mentioned, also even hugging at some point, it does give a sense that it is a relationship that is succeeding in their minds at least. And certainly when we look at the developing world, we look at the emerging powers in a increasingly multipolar international order, I would say. There are, I think, benefits to these sort of summits. I think there are real-world effects. You know, we see the expansion of BRICS, as I alluded to earlier. There are countries that do see benefit in further cooperating on this path in blocs that include China and Russia. Now, I don't think it's necessarily in opposition to the United States, but it is a sign that there are limits now more than ever this century to the U.S.-led world order. And there are challenges to that. And I think that what China and Russia are looking to do in meetings like this, and in various, of course, statements and strategic initiatives, is to say that there is another way and that you can work with us and that we won't be torn apart by these U.S. pressures. So, yes, I think that there are major countries out there and countries that are becoming more major players as time goes on that certainly see meetings like this and believe that there is added value in increasing cooperation with these two major powers.
Let me turn to Victor then and ask, really, Victor, how this is playing out now in Russia. Is this kind of widely seen as a win for Putin right now?
Well, it's important to note that when Western analysts and Western strategists share their concerns about the ever closer relationship between Moscow and Beijing, it's important to note that nobody did more to improve this relationship and to push Moscow and Beijing closer together than the United States and its staunchest allies. What effect did the American strategists think what did they think the effect of applying pressure on both Russia and China at the same time would have? Obviously, when Western powers, when the United States and its European allies have essentially launched a full-scale economic war against Russia, Russia doesn't really have too many choices apart from China as to who to depend on for economic relations and for exports and so forth.
Yeah, we've talked about that before, Victor. I mean, it doesn't go unnoticed from China's perspective, too. Not only has the West made life very difficult for Putin and for Russia, in a sense, but, I mean, China as well is up against NATO. It's up against AUKUS. It's up against even, the G7. Yes.
Exactly. So essentially...
I get it, but I'm asking
essentially, this is a trap. This is a trap that the United States has built for itself.
And you think it will backfire?
The way out of this trap, well, it's already backfiring. If the United States is concerned about a closer relationship between Russia and China, then we see it backfire. If the United States would have listened and taken into account at least some of Russia's geopolitical concerns over the last 2 decades, long before the current Ukrainian crisis emerged, then this situation could have gone on a different, it could have moved in a different trajectory.
Right, but we are where we are now, and your president is in China. Let me ask you, though, about this specific relationship now with China and Russia, because some would say it's not the most equal relationship in the world, with China being far more powerful economically and militarily, and Russia being in a somewhat weakened position because of sanctions, obviously, and the war in Ukraine. But Russia still is not used to being kind of the junior partner in any strategic alliance. So how is that feeling for Russian leadership?
Well, Russia was actually in the beginning of this century, 20 years ago, when Putin just started his first term. Russia was ready to be a junior partner to the United States. And Moscow feels that it was rebuffed many times. And so, the Cold War in the late 1980s and early 1990s ended the way it did. The United States and its allies won, and the Soviet Union lost. It collapsed, and the Warsaw Pact collapsed. So any relationship that Moscow would have had with the West after that would be a relationship of a weaker partner to a stronger partner. That's obvious. So for Russia, essentially, it was a choice. Either be a more or less dependent partner for the West, or today a dependent partner to China. And it was the West that rebuffed Russia and continues to rebuff it by ignoring Russia's concerns about NATO's expansion, by refusing to enter into talks on global stability and meaningful talks about the future of Ukraine, and by supplying the Ukrainian army with weapons that are used to kill Russian soldiers and officers.
I just want to get
civilians, by the way.
Tom's perspective here. I mean, is that an accurate analysis?
I think that certainly, if we go back to the history of the Cold War, which is brought up, if we look at the trajectory of these three powers, the U.S. and China partnered in a way to accelerate and support the fall of the Soviet Union. And so there's always been a U.S. strategy to try to divide the major rival powers. That's also being tried today again, but because both China and Russia have this experience and of course are informed by history, they're trying their best to resist those efforts. Yes, I think that at the beginning of this century, Russia saw a better relationship with the United States. And I think that did not turn out for a number of reasons. I think we could look at both countries' foreign policies and see why. I think that the prevailing sense of unipolarity that the U.S. was looking for certainly played a big role in that. And I think that the U.S. didn't see China as serious of a competitor as it would be today. When I started writing about this issue years and years ago, I came across so many analysts, particularly in the West, but all around the world, who would dismiss the China-Russia relationship, even as it was developing, as a marriage of convenience, essentially. That these two powers, they get along on certain issues, but their strategic differences are just too much for them to really form anything that even looks like an alliance. And I'm not suggesting they have an alliance now, but it's getting closer to that effect, and to the sense that they now have what I would call an entente of sorts, this strategic partnership. But as time went on, of course, we saw this cooperation only deepen. Even U.S. officials, I think, going back a decade or so, did not anticipate, even though the signs were all there, that these countries would seriously consider the level of cooperation they have right now. So again, I think that what it comes down to is how closely can these countries coordinate on their broader strategic issues and actually take into account one another's most strategic core interests when developing foreign policy plans. I think the war in Ukraine was seen as a moment of truth for this. Is this something that is so closely linked to what Russia sees as its foreign interests and China might disagree on? Would this really start to fray that relationship? And I think that we've seen that the opposite is actually true. They've actually enhanced cooperation, even if they don't completely align in all their statements. China, of course, says that it respects the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. At the same time, it says that Ukraine shouldn't be flooded with NATO arms. But the idea of a no limits partnership, which they're touting right now, is coming true. These meetings like this certainly speak to that.
Yeah, let me ask Zhao Ying about that. And in the context of this no limits partnership, as they describe it, I mean, how much does China want to cooperate with Russia? Because explain, if you can, where they still might diverge in their strategic interests. Where are they still at odds that if those interests are brought together, the China-Russia relationship will go even further?
Well, first of all, I mean, when we talk about this no-limit partnership, there is a precondition that this is still a partnership, not an alliance. And I think there is a fundamental difference in the mindset of building alliances and seeking partnerships. Because when we talk about building alliances, it is based on some kind of, Cold War mentality that one country's pursuit of its own security will make other countries more insecure. So countries need to align themselves with each other to find some kind of power balance. I mean, this might be true in what Hobbes would call a state of nature or international anarchy, but it does not fit into the world that we're living today, because we have United Nations, we have international institutions, and also we have, transnational corporations. So, I mean, and also I think if we look at the Ukraine war, I think the cause of the Ukraine war is exactly because NATO's eastward expansion is seen as a danger I mean, while it is seen as a way to pursue security by NATO, but it is seen as a threat from Russia's perspective. And then Russia's response to this kind of expansion is in turn seen as a threat to NATO. So that ultimately lead to the Ukraine war. I mean, this is a proof that how dangerous such kind of confrontational mentality could be. But what China is looking for is win-win cooperation, that we can work together to make the world a better place. And the central idea of seeking partnership is that this relationship is non-confrontational and not targeting any third parties.
Okay.
And also and also just now you mentioned about the strategic differences between China and Russia, but I think one of the most important, precondition of partnership is that we respect each other's strategic independence and strategic autonomy.
I just need to ask you very quickly, though, Zhao, is how China feels about its banks and the prospect of secondary sanctions being imposed on Chinese banks that are doing business with Russia, and the fact that they've had so much difficulty actually making payments. How is China looking to maybe, as a consequence of that, strengthen economic ties with Russia to get around with the West, the sanctions that are secondarily affecting China now too?
Yes, I mean, I think actually perhaps the West, the United States and Europe has been kind of exaggerating China's role in this Ukraine war, because they say that it is because of China's support that Russia has been able to survive the Western sanctions. It is because of China's support that Russia can continue its fight in Ukraine. But the fact is China is not sending weapons to Ukraine. It is not providing any military assistance. And it didn't create the war, and nor is it a party in the war. And it is just doing its normal trade with Russia. And actually not just China, most of the countries in the world, especially almost all countries of the global south, have refused to follow the Western sanctions against Russia. Actually, if you look at the figures, in 2022, India's trade with Russia increased by over 200%. And I remember Jaishankar once said that when the United States and Europe has been trying to lobbying countries to join the Western sanctions, the Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar said that Europe should give up its Eurocentric mindset. It should give up the mindset that Europe's problem is the world's problem.
Okay.
So, but does this mean that these countries all support Russia? I don't think so, because these countries, they are from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America. They have long been used as political pawns of the Western countries, or seen as a backyard of those Western industrialized countries.
Okay.
And now they just want to have their strategic independence.
Okay. Yeah, the clock is really against us. But Victor, very quickly, I mean, Russia has not suffered under sanctions the way the West had actually hoped. But to what extent has China really nullified the effects of those sanctions by upping its economic cooperation with Russia?
Well, for Russia, the longer the West's economic war against it continues, the more important each of its partners, other partners, trading partners becomes. That is true about China, that is true about India, and it's true about Russia's partners around the world, in Latin America, in Africa, throughout the Middle East. Most countries in the world are continuing to trade with Russia, are continuing their cooperation with Russia, continuing their cultural exchanges with Russia. So to make it short, if the West wants to mend its relationship with Russia, and first and foremost the United States and the United Kingdom, that are leading this crusade against Russia, then they will have to compromise. They will have to compromise even if they don't like it. They will have to compromise on Ukraine.
Okay.
They will have to compromise on NATO expansion, and they will have to compromise on taking into account Russia's geopolitical interests too.
Okay. Tom, I'm sorry, one final question for you, because I think this is important to ask. It was brought up in the introduction. Tell us how you think China is actually watching Russia now, and so far as its progress, if we can call it that, in the war in Ukraine. Is China seeing that as a model of sorts for maybe how things could develop between China and Taiwan?
Yeah, well, I certainly think that China's watching closely and probably sees some heartening developments lately when it comes to Russia's progress on the battlefield. You know, I've talked to Chinese experts and officials many times who believe that the war will end with a diplomatic settlement, but only when both powers have really exhausted what they see as their ability to fight the war. So I think we are getting to a critical moment in the Ukraine conflict, and I think that China wants to see itself as potentially playing a constructive role in diplomacy there, but only when the battlefield sort of situation has been exhausted. So when it comes to Taiwan, I think it is a very different issue as far as just how the military situation is outlined. Taiwan's a relatively small island, very close to the Chinese mainland. Ukraine's a vast country. Taiwan, of course, does enjoy a significant amount of U.S. And Western military support. But I think it is a very different situation. And I think certainly, though, China is taking notes when it comes to seeing how the Russia-Ukraine war played out. And in the event that China does seek to reunify by force, it is something I think that they are watching.
Tom, that will have to be the final word. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X. And do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.